In the autumn of 1994, in a small mill town in northern Vermont, a young man vanished on a two-lane road that everyone in town had driven 1,000 times. 30 years later, a construction crew tearing up an old foundation would find the one thing that was never supposed to surface again. Ashcombe Falls was the kind of town that looked like a postcard and felt like a held breath. The paper mill that once employed half the county had closed a decade earlier, and what remained was a main street of brick storefronts, with their upper windows boarded, a river that ran fast and cold under a covered bridge, and about 1,100 people who mostly kept to themselves. In October, the maples along Route 12 turned a deep, almost bruised red, and by 5 in the afternoon the light went thin and blue, the kind of dusk that made porch lights come on early all up and down the valley. It was a town where everyone still waved from their cars, and where everyone also, without quite admitting it, knew which houses to avoid and which roads not to walk after dark. Not because anything bad had ever happened there, but because the mill had left behind a kind of quiet that felt like it was listening. Daniel Reyes was 23, a mechanic's son who'd spent 2 years working at his father's garage on Depot Street before deciding he wanted something else. He just hadn't figured out what yet. He was quiet in the way people mistake for shyness, though his mother, Carol, knew better. Daniel noticed things. He noticed which regulars at the garage always paid in exact change, which ones lied about how long they'd let their brake pads wear down. He kept a small leather journal in his jacket pocket, not to write feelings in the way his mother sometimes hoped he would, but to sketch. Engines taken apart into their component pieces, the geese that came through in September, the exact shape of the ridge behind the house at different times of day, as if he were trying to catalog the town before he left it. He had his father's hands and his mother's patience, and neighbors would later say, in the careful way people talk about someone once something terrible has happened to them, that Daniel was the kind of boy who'd stop and help you push a stalled car off the road even if he was already running late. The one object he never took off was his grandfather's pocket watch. It didn't run anymore. The mechanism had seized up years before Daniel was even born, but his grandfather had carried it through a war and back, through a winter in a foxhole he never talked about except once, late, to Carol, when Daniel was a baby asleep in the next room. Daniel wore the watch more as a promise than a timepiece, tucked into the small pocket of his jeans on a length of braided leather cord he'd made himself at 14. Carol used to tease him that he'd wear a dead watch to his own funeral before he'd leave it in a drawer. He'd just smile and say some things didn't have to work to matter. That October, on a Thursday evening at the kitchen table, Daniel told his mother he'd gotten a callback, a real interview, salaried, at an auto shop up in Burlington that served the dealerships nobody else wanted to deal with. It was the kind of job that might finally get him out of Ashcombe Falls, or at least give him the choice of whether to stay. Carol remembered exactly what she'd made for dinner that night, the way she remembered exactly what she'd been wearing the day he was born. Pot roast, because it was his favorite. Though she told herself afterward it hadn't been a special occasion, she just happened to make it that week. The way mothers convince themselves of small mercies after the fact. He left the following afternoon, a Friday, throwing a duffel bag into the passenger seat of his truck and promising to call once he'd checked into the motel outside Burlington. Carol stood on the porch and watched him pull out of the driveway, watched the truck's taillights disappear around the bend by the old Hutchins place, and went back inside to start the dishes, expecting nothing more eventful than a phone call around 8. He never called. By Saturday morning, Carol had left 4 messages on the answering machine of a motel she'd never seen, each one a little more careful, a little more determinedly casual, as though sounding worried might somehow make the worry true. By Saturday afternoon, she'd called the auto shop directly, getting a confused receptionist who told her they had no interview scheduled with a Daniel Reyes. In fact, they had no opening at all. Carol stood in her kitchen holding the phone long after the woman had hung up, trying to make the sentence mean something other than what it meant. By Saturday night, she'd called the motel directly. No reservation had ever been made under his name. Daniel had never arrived, not at the motel, not at the interview that, as far as anyone could tell, didn't exist. She called the Ashcombe Falls Sheriff's Department at 9 p.m. Deputy Frank Talbot took the report over the phone, his voice carrying the particular patience of a man who'd fielded 100 calls like this one. A young man, a truck, a night that hadn't gone according to plan. He told Carol gently that in his experience, these things usually resolve themselves within 48 hours. Boys Daniel's age sometimes needed a night to themselves and forgot how loud their silence sounded from the outside. Carol thanked him and hung up and sat at the kitchen table until the light through the window turned from black to gray, not because she believed him, but because she didn't yet have anything else to do with the fear. Daniel's truck was found Sunday afternoon by a man delivering hay to a farm further up Route 12, who noticed the vehicle pulled half onto the shoulder about 6 miles outside town, at the exact spot where the road curved along the river just before the old covered bridge, a stretch locals called the Narrows, where the trees grew close enough on both sides to make headlights feel like they were driving through a tunnel even at noon. Talbot arrived within 20 minutes. The truck's doors were unlocked. The keys were gone, though the ignition showed no sign of tampering. Daniel's duffel bag sat untouched on the passenger seat, still zipped, a folded flannel shirt visible through the gap. There was no sign of a crash. No skid marks on the road, no damage to the fender or the frame, nothing broken in the underbrush along the shoulder that might have suggested the truck had swerved or been forced off. It looked, Talbot would say later, like a man had simply parked, stepped out, and stopped existing. What unsettled Talbot most wasn't any of that. It was the glove box. Daniel's registration and a folded road map were still inside, exactly where you'd expect them. But running his flashlight beam low across the dashboard, Talbot noticed a faint streaky sheen where fingerprints should have been. Not smudged. Wiped. Someone had gone over the interior with a cloth, carefully, deliberately, and left behind the one thing a rag can't erase, the absence of any prints at all. By Monday morning, a logger named Hollis Bream, who worked the ridge above the old mill property, walked into the sheriff's office with something that nobody quite knew what to do with. He said that on Friday night, sometime after 10, he'd heard a sound carrying up from the direction of the mill, metal on metal, rhythmic, like a heavy gate swinging on old hinges. He'd thought little of it at the time. The mill had been fenced and padlocked for the better part of a decade, and townsfolk had long since stopped paying attention to the sounds that came from that direction. Talbot logged the statement and, with no truck tracks, no reason yet to think the mill mattered, and a whole county to search, set it aside. The search itself grew fast into the kind of operation Ashcombe Falls hadn't seen in a generation. Volunteers arrived from 3 neighboring towns, filling the gravel lot by the covered bridge with pickup trucks and thermoses of coffee. State police brought in 2 K9 units. A local pilot offered to fly low passes over the ridge for free. And on the first full day, the cadaver dog gave investigators their strangest piece of evidence yet. Both handlers reported the same thing independently. The dog caught Daniel's scent strong and clear near the truck, followed it confidently into the underbrush toward the tree line, and then, less than 200 yards in, lost it completely. Not faded, lost, the way a scent disappears when a trail simply ends, as if Daniel had stepped off the edge of the world at that exact spot, and the tree line where it happened ran along the same ridge Hollis Bream had been working the night before. Nobody connected the 2 facts yet, but Talbot pulled the mill's caretaker in for questioning the next morning anyway, if only because Wayne Pruitt was one of the few people in town who still held keys to that stretch of fence. Pruitt was in his late 30s then, a solitary man who lived alone on the edge of town, and for 3 days he sat at the center of the investigation's attention. A witness placed him driving Route 12 near the Narrows sometime that Friday evening, and he was, notably, one of very few people who could have gotten past the mill's locked gates without leaving a mark. Talbot pressed him hard. Then the alibi came back, and it was airtight. 3 separate witnesses, a bartender and 2 regulars at a card game 2 towns over, placed Pruitt at a table from 7 o'clock that evening until well past midnight, the exact window during which Daniel had vanished. Talbot crossed him off the list within the week, and with him went the investigation's only real lead. Nobody thought to ask what Pruitt had been doing in the hour before 7. Divers searched the deepest bends of the river through the following weeks, working before the November cold made the work too dangerous to continue. They found nothing, no wreckage, no belongings, nothing to suggest the river had ever been involved at all, which only deepened the sense that whatever had happened to Daniel had happened on land, close to where his truck sat, in the direction the dogs had lost him, and the direction Hollis Bream's gate sound had come from. Flyers with Daniel's photograph, the same one from his father's garage, him leaning against a truck bed with a wrench in his hand, laughing at something out of frame, hung in gas station windows from Ashcombe Falls to the Canadian border, curling at the edges by spring. By the following spring, the case had gone quietly, officially cold, filed in a metal cabinet in the back of the Ashcombe Falls station, under a stack of other open files that only ever seemed to grow heavier, never lighter. Carol kept Daniel's room exactly as he'd left it. The bed made, the leather cord he sometimes used for the watch coiled in a small dish on the dresser when he wasn't wearing it. A stack of car magazines by the nightstand gathering a fine, undisturbed layer of dust. She never sold the truck. Nobody in Ashcombe Falls knew it yet. Not Talbot, not Carol, not even Hollis Bream, who would go to his own grave still telling people about that sound. But the metal on metal he'd heard that night hadn't come from the wind rattling a broken gate, and 30 years later, it would be the reason a mother finally learned what had happened to her son. 8 years passed before anything about the mill property changed. A developer bought the land in 2002 for a condo project that collapsed before it ever broke ground. But not before a clearing crew found a rusted service door half buried behind the old boiler house, sealed with a padlock fused solid by rust. It was logged as storage structure, condemned, and forgotten. The property sat untouched for another 22 years. Carol grew older in that same slow way towns do. She retired in 2015. Daniel's father died in 2019, still keeping a spare truck key on the garage hook, just in case. Carol kept it there after he was gone too, and told herself it was a habit. The break came almost by accident. In the spring of 2024, the town finally cleared the mill site for a riverside park. A backhoe operator named Curtis Iverson struck something solid near the boiler house. Not rock, not pipe, but a hollow metallic grate. Digging by hand, he and the site supervisor pried loose a rusted metal toolbox, wrapped in the rotted remains of a canvas tarp. Inside, a set of unlabeled keys, a photograph so warped by moisture it had dissolved into shadow, and a small leather journal, swollen and fused into a solid block. On the inside cover, pressed faintly into the leather, were 3 initials, DR. The discovery reopened wounds nobody in Ashcombe Falls had ever quite let close. Carol, 76 now, was contacted the same week. She recognized the journal before anyone finished describing it. Daniel had never gone anywhere without it. State conservators spent weeks separating pages fused together by decades of damp. Most had dissolved into illegible smears. But on one surviving page, pressed hard enough to survive where the ink of other pages hadn't, faint pencil marks spelled out a single unfinished fragment. The gate by the boiler. He keeps it locked, but The sentence ended there. Whatever Daniel had seen near that gate, whatever he'd been in the middle of writing down the night he vanished, he never finished putting it into words. The journal proved, for the first time in 30 years, that Daniel had been near the mill that night. Not on the open road where his truck was found, not down by the river where search teams had spent 3 days combing the banks, but at the one building nobody had ever thought to search beneath. Detective Nora Kessler was 34 years old and had been with the county's newly funded cold case unit for less than a year when the toolbox discovery landed on her desk. She hadn't grown up in Ashcombe Falls. She'd transferred up from a department downstate, drawn by a job posting that promised exactly the kind of work she'd wanted to do since she was in college, going back through the cases everyone else had given up on and asking, one more time, whether anyone had actually asked the right questions the first time around. She requested the original 1994 file the same afternoon the journal fragment was logged into evidence. It arrived in 3 cardboard boxes, the paper inside gone soft and yellow at the edges, photographs curling at their corners, and she spent the better part of a week reading through witness statements that 30 years of dust hadn't made any less careful, any less thorough. Talbot, she came to understand, had done a competent job with what he had. He simply hadn't had a journal entry mentioning a gate by the boiler house. Reading back through Wayne Pruitt's alibi statement for the 4th time, something Kessler's predecessors hadn't flagged began to bother her. Pruitt's 3 witnesses placed him at a card game in the next town over starting at 7 o'clock that Friday evening. But the drive from the mill property to that card game took, by Kessler's own test drive along the same roads 3 decades later, just under 25 minutes. Daniel's truck had been found less than a quarter-mile from the boiler house, at a bend in Route 12 that put it well within easy walking distance of the mill's rear gate. The alibi was airtight for anything happening after 7, but it left a window, before 7, that nobody in 1994 had thought to ask Pruitt to account for, because nobody in 1994 had any reason to think the mill itself mattered at all. What Kessler wouldn't fully understand until weeks later was that the mill had mattered to exactly one person, long after everyone else in town had stopped thinking about it at all. Kessler pulled county property records next, looking for anything connecting Pruitt to the mill site beyond his original employment there. What she found surprised her. Long after the mill's official closure, long after any company had any legitimate reason to maintain security on an abandoned property, Wayne Pruitt had continued paying a small annual fee to the county to retain what the paperwork called site security access, a private arrangement, apparently negotiated directly with the mill's absentee ownership group, that let him keep his keys to the gates for years after anyone else would have had a reason to. Stranger still was what she found when she pulled permits filed for the boiler house specifically. In 1996, 2 years after Daniel disappeared, someone had filed a minor renovation permit for the structure, describing the planned work only as converting part of the building into a private workshop. The permit was signed, in a slightly unsteady hand that the county clerk's office had nonetheless filed without question, by Wayne Pruitt. It wasn't the signature that stopped Kessler cold. It was the date. 2 years was long enough for a man to convince himself he'd gotten away with something, and just long enough, she'd learn, for something to force his hand. Kessler sat with that permit for a long time before she picked up the phone to request an excavation warrant. The dig began on a cold morning in early May, under a sky the color of wet slate, with a small crew of forensic technicians working alongside the same construction team that had found the toolbox weeks earlier. Ground-penetrating radar swept the boiler house foundation first, and within an hour, the technician running the scanner called Kessler over to the small monitor screen, pointing to a dark, rectangular anomaly beneath what should have been solid earth, a void roughly 6 feet by 10, sitting just below a section of concrete floor that radiocarbon dating on a core sample would later confirm had been poured sometime in 1996. Kessler would later say, "That was the moment the case stopped feeling like paperwork. It took most of the day to break through the concrete carefully enough to preserve whatever lay beneath it. When they finally did, in the fading gray light of late afternoon, the crew found themselves looking down into a narrow room, windowless, dug directly into the hillside and reinforced with cinder block that someone had clearly built by hand, without permits, without anyone else's knowledge. A rusted iron cot sat bolted into one wall. A drainage grate had been cut into the floor, and on the wall opposite the cot, scratched into the brick with something sharp, a nail perhaps, or a piece of broken glass, were 3 words that stopped the entire excavation crew cold. Technicians and deputies alike falling silent in a way that Kessler would later say she'd never experienced on a scene before or since. Still here, 1996. The room itself was empty. No remains, no clothing, nothing beyond the cot and the words on the wall and a small drainage grate that, when technicians finally worked it loose from decades of rust, revealed nothing beneath it but bare earth. Kessler crouched at the threshold for a long moment before she let anyone else step inside, not out of procedure, but because some part of her already understood that whatever this room could tell them, it wasn't going to be the end of the story. She was right. The room told its own story in other ways. Drag marks scored into the floor near the room's rear wall, faint but unmistakable under the technician's raking flashlight beams, led toward a second, smaller opening. A narrow service tunnel, barely wide enough for a single person to move through, crouched over, cut into the hillside and running deeper, away from the boiler house, toward a stretch of old rail bed that had once carried lumber cars down from the ridge to the mill's loading docks. Kessler understood immediately what the drag marks meant, even before she said it aloud to the rest of the team. Daniel hadn't died in that room. Whoever had built it, whoever had kept him there, had moved him somewhere else before the room was sealed beneath the concrete floor in 1996. In the same weeks, the renovation permit was filed. He hadn't been renovating a workshop, he'd been covering his tracks. The tunnel led somewhere. That much was obvious. Where? Took another 2 days of records requests to find out. Records of the old rail spur, pulled from county archives that had somehow survived 4 decades of budget cuts and office moves, showed that the line had once connected the mill to a small maintenance shed roughly 3 miles upriver, used originally to store equipment for track repairs. That shed had been formally decommissioned and sealed shut in 1997. The same year, Kessler discovered when she cross-referenced county employment records that Wayne Pruitt had abruptly left Ashcombe Falls for good, telling the few people who asked that he was heading south to care for a sick relative. No relative was ever named. No forwarding address had ever been filed with the county. He had simply left, and the town, grateful, in its way, to have one fewer reminder of a case it had never solved, had let him go without asking many questions. One name kept surfacing every time Kessler pulled a new record: property taxes, permits, a decommissioning order. It was always Wayne Pruitt's, and it was always filed alone, as though he'd spent 30 years making sure no one else's name would ever need to be attached to what he'd built. Finding the man himself turned out to be harder than finding the rooms he'd left behind. Kessler spent the better part of 2 months tracking Pruitt's movements across 3 decades, following a trail of part-time jobs, expired leases, and a handful of distant relatives who hadn't spoken to him in years and seemed unsurprised, in an uneasy sort of way, that the police were finally calling to ask about him. Twice the trail went cold entirely. Once at a P.O. box that had sat unclaimed since 2011. Once at a job reference that turned out to belong to a man who'd died 4 years earlier. Each dead end cost her a week she didn't feel she had. She found him eventually at a small fishing cabin on a lake 2 states away, living alone, in his early 60s now, with a fishing license renewed every year, and almost nothing else connecting him to the world beyond that. When deputies arrived at the cabin on a warm morning that August, Pruitt didn't run, and he didn't reach for anything. He was sitting on the porch step with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, as though some part of him had been waiting for this exact morning for a very long time. He set the coffee down, looked at the deputies for a long moment, and asked only one question before they'd even finished explaining why they were there. Is his mother still alive? When they told him yes, he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a debt he's been avoiding finally comes due. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He asked instead if he could show them where to look. The maintenance shed, he said, 3 miles upriver from the mill, exactly where the old rail line used to run. What the excavation team would find beneath that shed's floorboards would finally answer the question Carol Reyes had carried, unspoken, for 30 years. But it would take one more discovery, smaller, quieter, and somehow more devastating than everything that had come before it, to explain why Wayne Pruitt had never once, in 3 decades, been able to leave that answer fully behind him. The maintenance shed itself looked, from the outside, exactly like what it had once officially been. A weathered wooden structure with a collapsing roofline, its single door hanging loose on one hinge, surrounded by brush that had grown up thick and unbothered for nearly 30 years. Inside, the floor was bare plank, dust-covered, unremarkable, until a technician's boot found a section that gave slightly under pressure in a way old, solid wood shouldn't. Beneath those floorboards, investigators found a second concealed room, smaller than the one under the boiler house, but noticeably better constructed, built with the kind of care and attention that only comes from someone who has had time, and privacy, and no fear of interruption. Reinforced walls, a proper, if crude, ventilation shaft cut up through the shed's back wall. A room built not in haste, the way the first one clearly had been, but built to last. Built by someone who had already learned from experience what a room like this needed to hold up over time. It had been empty for decades, the air inside it stale and cold in the particular way that only comes from a space that has been sealed away from sunlight for a very long time. There were no remains here either, nothing that would ultimately allow the state's forensic examiner to determine, with any real precision, exactly when or how Daniel Reyes had died. But in the far corner of the room, half buried beneath a collapsed section of shelving, wrapped carefully in a scrap of oilcloth as though someone had once taken pains to protect it, investigators found Daniel's grandfather's pocket watch. It was stopped, exactly as it had always been, its hands frozen at the same hour they'd been frozen at since before Daniel was born. But tucked inside the watch case, folded small enough to have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't known to look, was a scrap of paper. Brittle, discolored, but legible, written in a hand that the state's document examiner would later confirm, through comparison with old-school assignments Carol still had in a box in her attic, belonged to Daniel Reyes. The note was undated, but its placement told its own story. Daniel had carried it with him from the boiler house room to this second one, folding and refolding it inside the watch case through the move itself. Adding to it, it seemed, over some stretch of time investigators could never precisely reconstruct, until, at some point in that second room, he had stopped adding to it at all. Tell my mother I kept it wound anyway. D. The watch had never worked. Not in Daniel's lifetime. Not in his grandfather's last years carrying it either. But somewhere in that room, in the dark, for however long he had, a young man who had nothing left of his old life but a dead watch, and the discipline of habit, had kept winding it every day regardless. Not because it told him the time, but because it was the one thing he had left that still connected him to the porch light his mother used to leave on, the kitchen table where she'd made him pot roast the night before he left, the promise a boy makes to a grandfather he never really knew, by refusing to let a small, useless machine go still in his hands. The interrogation room at the county sheriff's office had a single window, wired glass, looking out on a parking lot. Kessler sat across from Pruitt, with a water glass between them that neither of them touched. For the first 20 minutes, he said almost nothing. Not denials, not questions. Just his hands folded on the table, and his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder. The recorder hummed. Kessler had done enough of these to know that silence, held long enough, does more work than any question. It was the mention of the journal that broke it. She hadn't planned to lead with it, but she set the evidence photo on the table anyway. The fragment, the gate by the boiler. He keeps it locked, but and slid it toward him without comment. Pruitt looked at it for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she expected, almost apologetic, as though he were picking up a conversation that had simply been paused for 30 years, rather than started for the first time. He told her he had followed Daniel's truck from the edge of town that Friday night, watching from a distance as it slowed along the Narrows, and had used his old set of mill keys to intercept him near the covered bridge under the pretense of needing help with a stalled vehicle further down the access road. What happened after that, he described in flat, unemotional fragments that Kessler found more unsettling than any outburst could have been. How he'd walked Daniel back to the boiler house at gunpoint that first night. How the room beneath it hadn't existed yet. Only a locked storage closet he'd spent the following weeks reinforcing into something more permanent, while Daniel remained confined nearby. She asked him why. He didn't answer right away. He picked up the water glass for the first time, turned it a quarter turn on the table without drinking from it, and set it back down. I liked knowing exactly where someone was, he said finally. Once I started, I didn't know how to stop without everything unraveling. He explained, in that same even register, how the 1996 renovation crews working the failed condo project had gotten close enough to the boiler house that he'd panicked, and how he'd moved Daniel 3 miles upriver in the dead of night along the old rail bed, to the maintenance shed, to somewhere he was certain no one would ever look. He offered no motive beyond that, no grudge, no plan, nothing that connected to any specific harm Daniel had ever done him. Kessler pressed him twice more on the point, and both times he gave her some version of the same answer, delivered with the same unnerving calm, as if he'd turned it over in his own mind so many times over 30 years that it had worn smooth, lost whatever horror it might once have carried for him. The state's forensic examiner, working from what little physical evidence had survived the years of confinement, could not determine with any real precision exactly when or how Daniel had died. Likely, the report concluded, from an illness that went untreated sometime after his transfer to the maintenance shed, though even that remained an educated reconstruction rather than a certainty. Kessler asked Pruitt, near the end of the second session, what he had done with Daniel's remains afterward. He was quiet for nearly a full minute this time, long enough that she almost repeated the question, before he answered in a single sentence that the department chose, out of consideration for Carol, never to release publicly. Kessler would only say years later that it was the one piece of the case she wished she'd never had to hear confirmed out loud. Facing physical evidence that left no real room for a defense. The rooms themselves, the permit bearing his own signature, decades of payments to maintain access to a property he had no legitimate reason to still control. Pruitt pleaded guilty rather than face trial. He was sentenced that winter to life without the possibility of parole. He offered no statement at sentencing beyond a single sentence directed toward the gallery, where Carol sat in the second row with her hands folded in her lap. "I'm sorry it took this long for her to know." For Carol Reyes, the watch came home first, weeks before the rest of the case had even finished working its way through the courts. It arrived cleaned by a conservator, its cracked crystal replaced, its hands still frozen at the same hour they'd shown since before Daniel was born. She had it framed rather than repaired, mounted in a small shadow box alongside the note in Daniel's own hand, and hung it in the front hallway where she'd see it every time she left the house. She told a reporter, in the one interview she agreed to give after the sentencing, that she never wanted the mechanism fixed, that she wanted it to stay exactly the way her son had kept it, stopped and useless and wound anyway. Because that contradiction, she said, was the truest thing anyone had ever told her about him. The town of Ashcombe Falls built its long-delayed Riverside Park that same year, the funding finally secured once the county recognized what the property had come to mean to people well beyond the town's own borders. At its edge, near what remained of the old mill foundation, the town council voted unanimously to place a small bronze plaque, not naming the case directly, not turning the spot into the kind of attraction Carol had quietly asked them not to make it. Just 3 words, taken from the wall of the room where her son had once been kept. The words he'd scratched into brick with something sharp in the dark, in 1996, when he still believed, against every reasonable expectation, that someone would eventually come looking. Still here, Carol visits every October now, on the anniversary of the day Daniel left for a job interview he never reached, walking the new gravel path down to the spot where the plaque sits looking out over the river. She has said, more than once, to the few people who ask, that she doesn't come to grieve anymore, that 30 years of not knowing had already taught her every shape grief could take, and that what she feels now, standing at the water's edge each fall, is something quieter than that. She comes, she says, to wind the watch. It will never run again. She winds it anyway, once a year, standing where her son once stood without her, because some promises, she has come to believe, were never really about keeping time at all. If this story kept you watching, subscribe. We're building a new fictional cold case every week.